Thanks to Daniel and Rob, obviously, for hosting today. It's a great turnout. And for those who don't know me, I am James, the Chief Technical Officer for the Caravan Industry Association of Australia. And I'll be going through, I guess, the finer detail as what we know now in terms of the RVSA and how it will affect industry. So I'll give you a quick session overview. A lot of the things Daniel and Rob have already briefly touched on, but I'll go into a little bit more depth in terms of how they will affect us. So what's the RVSA and how will it affect me? The timeline, which I know we're all interested to find out what's our timeline, and industry involvement in the RVSA. We'll be looking at applying for the approvals, how to get them, the register of approved vehicles, which is a critical component of the legislation, which is known as the RAV. Obligations and responsibilities as an approval holder, that's going to be a big one for manufacturers and importers to understand. Regulatory enforcement powers, which is also really important to understand what's your obligations as an approval holder and how will it be enforced by the government. VSB1 and the RVSA, how will they interact moving forward? And as Daniel said, how will the RVSA affect the registration process, and particularly here in Victoria with Vic Roads. And then at the end, the Q&A if we've got time, and then we'll all be hanging around, myself and the rest of the RVMAP team, and Daniel and Rob, for any questions that may come up if you don't feel comfortable asking them in the Q&A session during at the end there. So what's the RVSA? So the RVSA stands for the Road Vehicle Standards Act, to be known as the RVSA 2018, and it's replacing the current MVSA, which is the Motor Vehicle Standards Act 1989. And it's to better reflect the significant changes in global and domestic vehicle markets and improvements in vehicle technologies over the last few decades. So lots changed in vehicle technology over the last 30 odd years, and the new legislation is set to reflect that. Rob and Daniel both touched on this as well, but I'll go through it again because it is important. How will the RVSA affect our industry? It's going to be fantastic for those guys doing the right thing. So you guys have taken the first step and definitely are involved and committed to coming to these kind of things to understand how to implement them in your business. So it's going to create a level playing field. It provides a barrier to entry, so no longer will you be able to essentially self-certify under VSB1. It'll improve the safety and compliance of the recreational vehicles in Australia from an ADR sense, which will then flow on to other regulations and standards. And it'll also now arm the federal government regulators with greater enforcement powers. So the very, very key changes under the RVSA for our industry is, yes, all towable recreational vehicle manufacturers and importers will now need to apply for an approval as a manufacturer or importer. The second aspect to that is you also need to obtain the relevant type approval or approvals for the trailers that you're wishing to provide, whether you're manufacturing them or importing them. Road vehicles will now need to have their details listed on the RAV, or the Register of Approved Vehicles, before they may be provided for use on Australian roads, so registered. So if they're not on the RAV, you cannot register them. So that's a key element there. And for the motor vehicle side of things, they will no longer need to affix physical compliance labels anymore. With the RAV, the Register of Approved Vehicles online will replace that requirement. Trailers, on the other hand, will still need to have vehicle plates fitted in addition to having the information on the RAV. So the key elements, I've done a bit of a diagram here. I'm not sure if any of you have seen the VSS version of this diagram. It's a gigantic V with about 1 million words on it, and it's very, very difficult to navigate. So I've attempted to try and make it more relevant for us. What I don't cover in any of this presentation is the concessional approval pathway. We're hoping and believe that most manufacturers and importers in this room and in the industry will go for the full type approvals or standard type approval pathway. So the first step there is you become an approved supplier of vehicles or trailers. So you need to be able to have control or influence over the design and manufacture of the trailers being produced. The second element to that is you'll need to get the type approval or type approvals for your trailers, which means you'll need to have full ADR compliance, you'll need to be able to demonstrate conformity of production, and you'll also need to have record keeping. The third element to that is then once you've manufactured or imported the product and it complies with those regulations and you have the approvals, those products will need to then be entered onto the RAV prior to being registered. So you need to be enrolled on the RAV, you need to hold the appropriate approvals, and obviously the details which we'll go into later. I'll do a full demonstration of exactly what the RAV is, what information goes on there. So once all that's done, you're then eligible to register that product in Australia with the state transport authorities, and then it can be subsequently used on the road. So the timeline, when's all this happening? We're currently in pre-commencement period, is what the government calls it. So the MVSAs are continuing in full. Businesses are starting to get ready for the RVSA. Two new pieces of information that we do have is that the applications for test facility approvals, so for those who are suppliers and component manufacturers who are looking to become test facilities, the applications for those will open up on the 10th of September. Same for component type approvals. If you're looking to get a new one or transition them across from your now component registration numbers or your SANs, that'll also open up from the 10th of September 2019. From the 10th of December 2019, all imported trailers must comply with the RVSA. So at the moment, that's going to be a bit of a challenge, which we've recognised, and the government also recognises as the challenge for the importers. We don't know a firm date yet as to when these guys can apply for their approvals to meet this deadline. So the government is committed to coming back to us with a strategy as to how these importers, or how the importers in the room can get their approvals in time. VSB 1 version 5 will still operate for domestic manufacturers through this time and through this transition period. Throughout this time, the MVSA will be repealed, and new operations. So if you're a new business starting, you will need to start operating in this transition period under the RVSA. You can't start using the MVSA and transition yourself across. If you're starting from scratch, you'll be starting with the RVSA legislation. And then from 10th of December 2020, we're in full operation. So all the MVSA approvals will end and everyone will be operating under the RVSA. So that's when we'll really start to see a definite shift and change in industry, when everyone's now operating under these type of approvals and under these conditions. As Daniel and Rob mentioned before, we've been actively involved for 5 years in the RVSA when it was coming through, before it was passed, having input in terms of what was going to go on the RAV, finer details as to what was going to be included in this and that. So we've been involved as much as we can be in that. We've been participants in the 4 consultation groups, which are still meeting now. We've got the next one in early July in Brisbane. So they're 2 days, 4 consultation groups on all aspects of the RVSA and how that will be implemented. So we are in there to make sure we understand it from our industry, and then to push back if we've got any concerns, and also to suggest any changes that may help us. And we will obviously continue to work with the state associations and industry businesses throughout these changes.